echoed Tiffany Rhodes as she strode through the gleaming marble lobby of Monarch Industries, her heels echoing against the polished floor. The receptionist's eyes widened in recognition, then narrowed with barely concealed confusion. "Miss Rhodes," she stammered, "Mr. Westwood isn't expecting you." Tiffany's confident smile faltered for just a heartbeat. The email had been crystal clear. 9 o'clock sharp, executive floor, final interview with Brian Westwood himself. She smoothed her tailored suit, the one she'd spent 3 months of savings on, and clutched her leather portfolio tighter. "There must be some misunderstanding. I have the confirmation right here." As the elevator climbed toward the 40th floor, Tiffany's reflection stared back at her, a woman who had fought for every opportunity, who had sacrificed everything for this moment. What she didn't know was that her resume had been accidentally switched with another candidate's, that the position had already been filled, and that the notoriously demanding CEO of Monarch Industries never, ever made exceptions. But in 7 days, Brian Westwood would risk his empire, his reputation, and his guarded heart just to keep her by his side. The executive floor of Monarch Industries existed in a different universe from the world 40 stories below. Tiffany Rhodes stepped out of the elevator into hushed opulence. Italian marble beneath her feet, walls of glass revealing Manhattan's glittering skyline, and the distinct scent of power, sandalwood, leather, and ambition. She'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her small Brooklyn apartment. Harvard Business School with honors, 5 years at boutique investment firms, recommendations that had opened this door, a door that less than 1% of applicants ever passed through. Yet as she approached the imposing reception desk, the blonde woman seated there looked at her as if she were a lost tourist rather than Monarch's newest potential executive. "I'm sorry, but there must be some confusion," the woman said, her voice carrying the practiced neutrality of someone accustomed to turning people away. "Mr. Westwood's schedule is completely full today." Tiffany maintained her composed expression, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "I received confirmation yesterday. 9 o'clock interview for the senior financial strategist position." She slid the printed email across the polished surface. The woman examined it with a frown that deepened with each passing second. "This is irregular. Please wait here." As Tiffany stood alone in the reception area, she felt the weight of unseen eyes. Through glass walls, executives in tailored suits glanced her way, their expressions varying from curiosity to dismissal. Monarch Industries represented the pinnacle of financial power in New York. Old money, old connections, and even older traditions. People like her weren't typically invited to this floor unless they were serving coffee. 23 minutes later, Tiffany had counted each one. A harried woman with auburn hair twisted into a severe bun emerged from a side corridor. "Miss Rhodes, I'm Victoria Palmer, HR Director." Her handshake was brief, her expression troubled. "There's been a significant error. Your resume was confused with another candidate's. The position you applied for was filled last week." The words struck Tiffany with physical force. After 6 grueling interviews, after the background checks and the testing, after the email that had made her dance around her apartment in joyful disbelief. "That's not possible," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I spoke with Mr. Chandler just yesterday. He confirmed everything. Mr. Chandler is on personal leave. His assistant must have..." Victoria's explanation trailed off as her attention shifted to something behind Tiffany. Her posture straightened instantly. "Mr. Westwood, I didn't expect you back until 11. Tiffany turned. Brian Westwood stood at the entrance to the reception area, a study in controlled power. 6'2", broad-shouldered, with features that seemed carved from granite, sharp cheekbones, strong jaw dusted with perfectly maintained stubble, and eyes the color of a winter storm. Not handsome in the conventional sense, but magnetic in a way that made it impossible to look elsewhere. "The Tokyo call ended early," he said, his voice deep and clipped. His gaze, cool and assessing, settled on Tiffany. "You are?" Before Victoria could intervene, Tiffany stepped forward. "Tiffany Rhodes, Mr. Westwood. I'm here for the senior financial strategist position." "That position has been filled." His response was immediate and final, delivered without emotion, as he turned toward his office. "There seems to have been a clerical error," Victoria explained quickly, shooting Tiffany an apologetic glance. "Miss Rhodes received confirmation in error. I was just explaining." "Not my concern." Brian Westwood was already moving away, attention shifting to his phone. Something in his dismissal, so casual, so complete, ignited a spark in Tiffany's chest. After years of being overlooked and underestimated, after fighting for every opportunity, she wasn't about to be brushed aside without a word. "Mr. Westwood," she called after him, her voice carrying across the hushed reception area. "I believe it is your concern when your company extends a professional commitment and then breaks it." The entire floor seemed to freeze. Victoria's face paled. Even the receptionist stopped typing mid-word. Brian Westwood turned slowly, his expression unchanged, except for one slightly raised eyebrow. For 3 excruciating seconds, he studied her as if she were a puzzle he hadn't expected to encounter. "Victoria, bring Miss Rhodes to my office." He turned and disappeared through a set of frosted glass doors. Victoria released a breath that sounded like it had been held for minutes. That was either very brave or very foolish. "I'll let you know which when I find out," Tiffany replied, adjusting her grip on her portfolio. Inside Brian Westwood's office, floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Manhattan that stole Tiffany's breath. The space was minimalist but unmistakably luxurious. A massive desk of polished walnut, a seating area with leather furniture the color of aged cognac, and a single abstract painting that probably cost more than her student loan debt. Brian stood with his back to the door, silhouetted against the city sprawled beyond the glass. Without turning, he spoke. "Victoria, the Nakamura documents." Victoria stepped forward, placing a leather folio on his desk. "They'll be calling back in 20 minutes, and I have the Blackstone revisions you requested. Later, that's all." With a sympathetic glance at Tiffany, Victoria retreated, closing the door behind her. Only then did Brian Westwood turn, fixing Tiffany with a gaze that seemed to catalogue every detail, from her carefully chosen suit to the determined set of her shoulders. He didn't invite her to sit. "You have 30 seconds to explain why I shouldn't have security escort you out." Tiffany met his gaze directly. "Because Monarch Industries made a commitment to me, Mr. Westwood. Whether through error or not, that commitment matters. It matters to your reputation and to mine." 20 seconds. "I've spent 5 years analyzing corporate weaknesses and turning them into strengths. I've doubled the performance of client portfolios during the worst recession in a decade. I speak 3 languages, including Mandarin, which I'm guessing might be useful for your expanding Asian markets." His expression remained impassive. 10. Tiffany took a breath, gambling everything on a hunch. "And because I know you're about to lose the Nakamura deal unless you address their concerns about your sustainable energy portfolio, which is precisely what I specialized in at Wharton." The silence that followed was absolute. Brian Westwood's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted, like a door cracking open a millimeter. "How do you know about Nakamura?" "It's been in the financial press for months. They've been very public about prioritizing partners with demonstrable commitments to sustainability. Your company's last quarterly report showed minimal investment in that sector." She nodded toward the folio on his desk. "And Victoria just mentioned they're calling back in 20 minutes. A soft chime from his computer interrupted the tense standoff. Brian glanced at his screen, and for the first time, his composure wavered, a slight tightening around his eyes, a barely perceptible clenching of his jaw. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to one of the chairs before his desk as he took his own seat. Tiffany complied, crossing her legs at the ankle and placing her portfolio in her lap. "Our Tokyo team just sent preliminary feedback from Nakamura's board," Brian said, his fingers moving across his keyboard. "They're concerned about our environmental initiatives, or apparent lack thereof." "May I?" Tiffany nodded toward his computer. After a moment's hesitation, Brian turned the screen toward her. As she read, Tiffany's analytical mind clicked into high gear. She recognized an opportunity when she saw one. "You don't actually have a sustainability problem, Mr. Westwood. You have a communication problem." She opened her portfolio and withdrew several documents. "As it happens, I prepared an analysis of Monarch's market positioning, including untapped potential in environmental sectors." Brian's eyes narrowed slightly. "You just happened to prepare this?" "I prepare thoroughly for every interview, especially for a company that controls over $30 billion in assets." For the first time, something like respect flickered in Brian Westwood's expression. He accepted the documents, scanning them with practiced efficiency. "These figures on our renewable energy holdings," he said after a moment, "they're different from our public filings." "Because I looked deeper," Tiffany explained. "Monarch owns significant stakes in 16 different companies with substantial green technology divisions. Individually, none crosses the threshold for mandatory reporting. Collectively, they represent nearly 12% of your portfolio. Nakamura wants 8% commitment as their minimum threshold." Brian studied her with new intensity. "And you determined this how? Public records, industry publications, and analyzing acquisition patterns." She allowed herself a small smile. "What others see as unrelated data points, I see as constellations waiting to be connected." The intercom on Brian's desk buzzed. "Mr. Westwood, Nakamura is online 2 minutes early." Brian held Tiffany's gaze for a long moment, calculation evident in his eyes. Then he made a decision. "Stay," he said, reaching for the phone. "Don't speak unless I indicate." For the next 17 minutes, Tiffany witnessed the legendary negotiating skills of Brian Westwood in action. His voice transformed, becoming warmer, more measured, occasionally even charming. He addressed the concerns of Mr. Nakamura with confidence, referring several times to Monarch's long-standing commitment to environmental stewardship and strategic investments in next-generation green technologies. When Mr. Nakamura asked for specifics, Brian glanced at Tiffany, then slid her analysis across the desk. She pointed to key figures, and Brian incorporated them seamlessly into his responses. By the time the call ended, the Nakamura representative was expressing renewed enthusiasm for the partnership. "We look forward to finalizing the details next week, Mr. Westwood." "As do I, Mr. Nakamura. My team will send the updated portfolio analysis today." After hanging up, Brian leaned back in his chair, studying Tiffany with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between suspicion and curiosity. "That," he said finally, "was unexpected. I'm glad I could help. The question remains, what am I supposed to do with you, Miss Rhodes?" He steepled his fingers beneath his chin. "The position you applied for has been filled. By someone with connections to 3 board members, I might add." Tiffany maintained her composed exterior, though inside, disappointment crashed through her. She'd come so close. "I understand," she said, gathering her portfolio. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Westwood. I didn't dismiss you." The sharpness in his tone stopped her mid-movement. I need someone to compile the complete analysis for Nakamura. Victoria is overextended, and clearly you understand what they're looking for." Tiffany carefully settled back in her chair. "You want me to prepare the report? I'm offering you 1 week. Temporary position, special project basis. You'll be given access to the complete portfolio data." His eyes held hers, challenging. "Prove this wasn't a fluke, and we'll discuss more permanent possibilities." It wasn't the position she'd applied for. It wasn't even a guarantee. But it was a foot in the door of a company that had never opened its doors to someone like her. "When do I start?" she asked. The barest hint of a smile touched the corner of Brian's mouth, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "You already have," he said, pressing a button on his desk. "Victoria, prepare temporary credentials for Miss Rhodes. She'll be working on the Nakamura project." He paused, then added, "And find her a workstation adjoining mine." As Victoria entered with barely concealed surprise, Tiffany realized that in the span of 1 hour her life had unraveled and then rewoven itself into an unexpected pattern. What she didn't yet understand was that from the moment she walked into his office, something fundamental had shifted in Brian Westwood's carefully controlled world. For the first time in years, he'd encountered someone who didn't flinch under his gaze, someone who saw patterns others missed. And though he'd never admit it, not yet, as he watched her follow Victoria from his office, her head held high, he knew he wanted to see what other constellations Tiffany Rhodes could reveal in his universe. Morning light streamed through the windows of Tiffany's Brooklyn apartment as she stood before her modest closet, examining her workwear options with newfound scrutiny. After yesterday's unexpected turn of events, she needed armor. Not just any outfit would suffice for her second day at Monarch Industries. She selected a structured navy dress with subtle gold accents, professional, confident, but not trying too hard. As she applied her makeup with practiced precision, Tiffany's mind raced through everything she knew about Brian Westwood. 37 years old, inherited Monarch at 29 after his father's sudden death. Doubled the company's value in less than a decade, never married, notoriously private, rumors of ruthlessness that followed him like a shadow. 1 week, she whispered to her reflection. Make it count. The executive floor hummed with different energy when Tiffany arrived at 7:30, a full hour before her scheduled start time. Staff moved with purpose, the atmosphere charged with the quiet intensity of serious money in motion. Victoria intercepted her at reception, expression a mix of surprise and approval at Tiffany's early arrival. "Your security credentials and system access are ready," she said, handing Tiffany a sleek badge. "Mr. Westwood is already here. He's always first in, last out." Victoria led her through the labyrinth of glass and steel to a workstation positioned directly outside Brian's office, a space clearly hastily repurposed, as evidenced by the lingering personal effects of its previous occupant. "This was Allison's desk," Victoria explained, noting Tiffany's questioning glance at a forgotten framed photo. "Mr. Westwood's executive assistant for 3 years. She left suddenly last week." The unspoken message hung in the air. People who failed to meet Brian Westwood's standards didn't last long. "The Nakamura files are in the secure database," Victoria continued. "You'll have access level 4 clearance, unusually high for a temporary position." Her expression conveyed the significance. "Mr. Westwood expects the preliminary analysis by noon." 4 hours for a complete portfolio review? Tiffany asked, unable to mask her surprise. Victoria's smile held no humor. "Welcome to Monarch." Before Tiffany could respond, Brian's deep voice came from the doorway of his office. "Victoria, the Bennett conference call has been moved up. 8:15. His eyes shifted to Tiffany, noting her early arrival without comment. "Miss Rhodes, the Nakamura data is ready for your review. I've included confidential projections for our Southeast Asian expansion. Familiarize yourself with them." He disappeared back into his office, leaving no room for questions or hesitation. Tiffany sat down and logged into the system with the credentials Victoria had provided. The scope of information available to her was staggering. Detailed financials of Monarch's extensive holdings, investment strategies spanning 5 continents, and projections for markets not yet publicly targeted. For the next 3 hours, she immersed herself completely, barely registering the increasing activity around her as the office filled. She worked with focused intensity, building a comprehensive analysis of Monarch's environmental portfolio, identifying hidden strengths, and crafting a narrative that would satisfy Nakamura's requirements without revealing strategic vulnerabilities. At 11:45, 15 minutes ahead of deadline, she knocked on Brian's door. "Enter," came his clipped response. Brian sat behind his desk, tie loosened slightly, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, as he studied multiple screens displaying market data. He didn't look up as she placed the completed report before him. "The Nakamura analysis, sir." He glanced at his watch. 15 minutes early. It wasn't praise, merely observation. "I believe it addresses all their concerns while maintaining Monarch's negotiating position." Brian finally looked up, his steel-grey eyes studying her with that same inscrutable expression. "We'll see." He opened the file, beginning to read. After several seconds, he said, "That's all, Miss Rhodes." Dismissed, Tiffany returned to her desk, aware of curious glances from nearby executives. She was the anomaly, the unknown factor in their carefully calibrated environment. As she settled back at her computer, she noticed a message from Victoria requesting lunch orders for a management meeting. With no direct instructions, Tiffany busied herself analyzing additional data, building a more comprehensive understanding of Monarch's operations. 30 minutes passed before Brian's voice came through the intercom on her desk. "Miss Rhodes, my office." Inside, Brian stood looking out over the city, the Nakamura report open on his desk. Without turning, he spoke. "This analysis identifies 3 potential partnership opportunities I wasn't aware of." "Yes," Tiffany confirmed. Monarch's subsidiary in Singapore has been developing waste-to-energy technology that aligns perfectly with Nakamura's environmental initiatives. It's been operating under the radar, but could be positioned as a cornerstone of your sustainability commitment. Brian turned, his expression unreadable. "You extracted this from our general data files in less than 4 hours." The connection seemed obvious once I reviewed the portfolios side by side. It wasn't obvious to my team of analysts who've been working on this deal for 6 months. He picked up the report. "I'm forwarding this to Nakamura this afternoon. You'll join the video conference at 4 to address any technical questions." Tiffany's pulse quickened. "Of course." In the meantime, the executive committee is meeting over lunch to discuss the Blackstone merger. You'll attend. "Take notes, observe only." His eyes narrowed slightly. "The people in that room represent the heart of Monarch's power structure. Most of them have spent decades earning their seats at that table." The implication was clear. She was an interloper, present on sufferance. The executive dining room occupied the northwest corner of the floor, offering breathtaking views of the Hudson River. 12 people were already seated at a polished mahogany table when Brian entered with Tiffany, a respectful step behind. Conversation died instantly. Tiffany felt the weight of evaluation in every gaze that turned toward her. "This is Miss Rhodes," Brian said simply. "She's working with me on the Nakamura project." He took his place at the head of the table without further explanation. As Tiffany settled into the only remaining seat, directly across from a silver-haired man whose disapproving expression couldn't have been clearer, she recognized the power dynamics at play. These were the king's court, and she was the uninvited guest. "We were just discussing the integration timeline for Blackstone," said a woman in her 50s, her British accent crisp. "Lawrence has concerns about their corporate culture." The silver-haired man, Lawrence, barely took his eyes off Tiffany as he replied, "Blackstone has built their reputation on aggressive tactics and questionable ethics. Bringing them under the Monarch umbrella risks contaminating our brand." "Their Asian portfolio is worth the risk," countered a younger executive. "We need their inroads to the Chinese market." "At what cost, Charles?" Lawrence's tone was cutting. "Monarch has stood for something in this industry. My father and Gerald Westwood built this company on principles of times change," Brian interrupted, his voice brooking no argument. "The Blackstone acquisition moves forward as planned. Integration concerns will be addressed by the transition team." Lawrence's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. The power hierarchy was evident. Brian's word was final. Throughout the lunch, Tiffany observed the interplay of alliances and animosities, carefully noting which executives deferred to whom, who spoke freely, and who remained strategically silent. She wrote detailed notes on the merger discussion while absorbing the unspoken politics swirling around the table. When questions about specific financial projections arose, Tiffany noticed Brian glancing at notes that seemed incomplete. Without thinking, she slid her tablet toward him with the relevant data already displayed. He glanced at it, incorporated the figures seamlessly into his response, and returned the tablet with a nearly imperceptible nod. Lawrence noticed the exchange, his eyes narrowing. As the meeting concluded, Brian was pulled aside by two board members, leaving Tiffany to exit alone. She had nearly reached the door when Lawrence intercepted her. "Miss Rhodes, is it?" His smile didn't reach his eyes. "I don't recall seeing your name among our executive personnel." "I'm working on a special project for Mr. Westwood," she replied evenly. "Indeed. How fortunate for you." His gaze traveled over her with insulting thoroughness. "A word of advice. Monarch isn't a place for temporary visitors. Some of us have dedicated our lives to this institution." "I appreciate your commitment to the company, Mr. Lawrence." "Winterfield," he corrected coldly. "Lawrence Winterfield. My father founded this firm alongside Gerald Westwood. I've watched many come and go from Brian's orbit. Most don't last a month." Before she could respond, Victoria appeared at her elbow. "Miss Rhodes, Mr. Westwood needs you to prepare for the Nakamura call." Grateful for the interruption, Tiffany nodded politely to Lawrence and followed Victoria from the room, feeling his gaze burning into her back. "Lawrence Winterfield isn't someone you want as an enemy," Victoria murmured as they walked. "He's been gunning for Brian's position since Gerald died. Office politics aren't my concern," Tiffany responded. "I'm here to do a job." Victoria's laugh was soft and knowing. "Everyone says that their first week." The afternoon passed in a blur of preparation. The Nakamura video conference proved successful beyond expectations, with the Japanese executives responding positively to Tiffany's detailed presentation of Monarch's environmental initiatives. When she highlighted the waste-to-energy technology being developed in Singapore, Mr. Nakamura himself expressed particular interest. By the time the call ended, the tentative partnership had transformed into a nearly certain alliance. "We will forward the formal agreement tomorrow," Mr. Nakamura said, bowing slightly to the camera. "We look forward to a prosperous relationship, Mr. Westwood." "Udu." When the video feed ended, Brian remained seated, studying Tiffany with an expression she couldn't read. "That went well," she ventured. "It did," he acknowledged. "The Singapore initiative was particularly effective. You presented it confidently." Coming from him, it was high praise. "Thank you for the opportunity." "Don't thank me yet, Miss Rhodes." He stood, straightening his tie. "We have a problem with the Blackstone financials that needs to be addressed tonight." Their reported valuation doesn't align with my team's analysis. Tiffany glanced at her watch. Nearly 7 in the evening. Tonight? Is that an issue? The question carried a clear test. Not at all. She squared her shoulders. What do you need me to do? Review their last 3 quarterly reports against our independent valuation. Find the discrepancy. He picked up his suit jacket. I have a dinner with the mayor I can't reschedule. I'll be back by 10 to review your findings. Without waiting for her response, he strode from the conference room, leaving Tiffany to contemplate the long night ahead. By 9:45, Tiffany had been working non-stop for over 14 hours. The executive floor had emptied hours ago, leaving her alone in the pool of light from her desk lamp. Her eyes burned from staring at financial statements, but her determination hadn't wavered. She'd found it, the discrepancy Brian was looking for. Blackstone had been artificially inflating certain asset valuations, using creative accounting to make their Chinese holdings appear more valuable than they actually were. Stretching her stiff shoulders, Tiffany gathered her notes and walked to the break room for coffee. As she rounded the corner, she stopped short. Brian stood at the window, jacket discarded, tie loosened, staring out at the illuminated city. Something in his posture, a rare moment of unguarded weariness, made her hesitate to interrupt. As if sensing her presence, he spoke without turning. Dinner ended early. The mayor is predictably corrupt, but surprisingly efficient. I've found something in the Blackstone reports, Tiffany said, approaching cautiously. Their Chinese holdings are overvalued by approximately 22%. Brian turned, and in the dimmed evening lighting, his face appeared different. The hard edges softened, revealing the toll of responsibility he typically concealed. Show me. They moved to a small conference room, where Tiffany laid out her findings. As she explained the discrepancies, Brian listened with complete focus, occasionally asking incisive questions that revealed his formidable intellect. This could derail the entire acquisition, he said finally, running a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of frustration. Or give you leverage to renegotiate terms, Tiffany suggested. Blackstone needs this deal as much as Monarch does. They're overextended in European markets, and their liquidity position is weaker than they're letting on. Brian studied her with new intensity. How do you know about their European exposure? Public filings, cross-referenced with trade publications and market analysis. I did some research during lunch. She hesitated, then added, after what Lawrence Winterfield said, I wanted to understand the full context of the merger. What exactly did Lawrence say to you? Brian's voice had taken on a dangerous edge. Nothing of consequence. Tiffany maintained her professional tone. Office politics don't interest me, Mr. Westwood. I'm focused on delivering results. For a long moment he held her gaze, searching for something. Then, unexpectedly, the corner of his mouth lifted in what might almost have been a smile. Most people would have been intimidated by Lawrence. I didn't come this far by letting intimidation dictate my actions. No, Brian agreed, his voice softening slightly. I don't imagine you did. A moment of silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but charged with unspoken recognition. Brian broke it first, glancing at his watch. It's nearly 11. You've been here since 7 this morning. The work needed to be done. He studied her again, that calculating look returning. Victoria told me you arrived at 7:30, not 8 as scheduled. I wanted to get a head start on the Nakamura analysis. Why? The question was simple, but pointed. Tiffany considered her answer carefully. Because opportunities like this don't come often for people like me, Mr. Westwood. When they do, I don't waste them. Something flickered in his eyes, recognition perhaps, or memory. For a brief moment, Brian Westwood seemed to see her not as a temporary asset or a surprising solution to a problem, but as a person with a journey not entirely unlike his own. "You should go home, Miss Rhodes. Tomorrow will be equally demanding." Tiffany gathered her notes. "Will there be anything else tonight?" Brian shook his head. "My car service can take you home." "It's too late for the subway." "That's not necessary. I'll be fine. It wasn't a suggestion." His tone had returned to its usual authoritative cadence, but something had shifted between them. As Tiffany rode in the sleek black Monarch car through nighttime Manhattan toward Brooklyn, she replayed the long, unexpected day. She had survived her first 24 hours in Brian Westwood's orbit, not just survived, but perhaps begun to carve out a place for herself. What she didn't yet realize was that in the quiet of his office, Brian Westwood was reviewing her personnel file, learning about the scholarship student who had worked 3 jobs to put herself through Harvard, who had graduated top of her class despite starting with none of the advantages of her peers. Nor could she know that for the first time since taking control of Monarch Industries, Brian was intrigued by someone who saw the world as he did, as a puzzle waiting to be solved by those brave enough to challenge convention. 6 days remained of her trial period, 6 days to prove she belonged in a world that had never been designed to include her, 6 days before Brian Westwood would need to decide if he could risk letting her go. Dawn broke over Manhattan as Tiffany arrived at Monarch Industries for her 3rd day. The security guard, who now greeted her by name, informed her that Mr. Westwood had requested she come directly to the executive garage when she arrived. Descending to the subterranean level, Tiffany found Brian standing beside a gleaming black Bentley, engrossed in conversation on his phone. He wore a charcoal suit that emphasized his broad shoulders, his presence commanding even in this concrete cavern of luxury vehicles. He ended his call as she approached. "You received my message about the Hamptons?" "Victoria called last night. She mentioned an emergency strategy session for the Blackstone merger." Tiffany adjusted the strap of her overnight bag. Victoria's instructions had been precise. Pack for 2 days, business casual, prepare for intensive work sessions. Brian nodded, his expression giving away nothing as he opened the passenger door. "Based on your findings about their valuation discrepancies, we need to recalibrate our entire approach before Monday's board presentation. My estate has a fully equipped office that will give us privacy from prying eyes at Monarch." The unspoken concern hung between them, Lawrence Winterfield and his faction. As they left the city behind, Brian divided his attention between his phone and his laptop, occasionally breaking the silence with incisive questions about Tiffany's analysis of Blackstone's financials. Despite his focus on work, Tiffany noticed subtle differences in him away from the office, a slight loosening of his rigid control, moments when his guard lowered infinitesimally. "You mentioned last night that opportunities don't come often for people like you," he said suddenly, his eyes remaining on the road. "Explain." Tiffany considered deflecting but chose honesty instead. "I grew up in South Side Chicago with a single mother who worked 3 jobs. Harvard was a dream that required academic scholarships and student loans that I'll be paying off for another decade. The financial world tends to favor those with connections, not just credentials. And yet you pursued it." "Numbers don't care about your background," she replied. "Financial patterns don't discriminate. I discovered early that I could see relationships in data that others missed." She paused. "What about you? Did you always know you'd lead Monarch?" A shadow passed over Brian's expression. "It was expected. My father made that clear from the beginning. But not what you would have chosen." Brian's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "I was studying architectural engineering when my father died. The board needed immediate leadership to prevent a stock plummet. There was no choice to make." Before Tiffany could respond, they turned through massive iron gates onto a tree-lined driveway that curved toward the ocean. Brian's estate was a masterpiece of modern architecture, glass and stone perched on a cliff overlooking the Atlantic, with expansive terraces and floor-to-ceiling windows that captured the dramatic coastline. "This is breathtaking," Tiffany murmured as they stepped into the soaring main hall. "My design," Brian said quietly, watching her reaction. "I completed it 2 years ago." Tiffany turned to him in surprise. "You designed this house?" Architecture remained a hobby. For a brief moment, something like genuine emotion flickered in his eyes. Pride mingled with wistfulness. "The housekeeper has prepared the East Guest Suite for you. We'll convene in the study in 30 minutes to begin work." Brian's study reflected the man himself, meticulously organized, unapologetically masculine, with panoramic views of the restless Atlantic. The space was clearly designed for serious work, with multiple screens, a conference table, and walls of financial reference books. For the next 8 hours, they worked with singular focus, dismantling Blackstone's financials and reconstructing Monarch's acquisition strategy. Tiffany was impressed by Brian's stamina and attention to detail. He processed complex information with remarkable speed, challenging her analysis with questions that pushed her to defend her conclusions. As evening fell, they moved to the kitchen, where Brian surprised her by preparing a simple meal of pasta and wine. In the warm glow of pendant lights hanging over the marble island, Tiffany watched him move with unexpected ease in this domestic setting. "You cook?" she observed, accepting the glass of Cabernet he offered. "My mother insisted I learn," he replied, stirring the sauce. She believed wealth was no excuse for helplessness in basic skills. "Tell me about her." The question slipped out before Tiffany could consider its personal nature. Brian was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. "She was brilliant," he finally said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "A structural engineer who gave up her career to be the perfect Westwood wife. I think she regretted it, though she never said so directly." "Is she still—" "She died when I was 19. Cancer." He served the pasta with an efficiency that discouraged further questions. "We should discuss the presentation strategy for the board. Lawrence will look for any weakness to exploit." They ate at the kitchen island, the conversation returning to safer professional territory. Yet something had shifted, a small breach in the wall Brian maintained between himself and the world. Later, as they continued working in the study, Tiffany noticed Brian rubbing his shoulder, a grimace briefly disrupting his composed expression. "Old injury?" she asked. "Rowing accident in college. It flares up when I spend too many hours at a desk." He rotated his shoulder, trying to ease the discomfort. "My mother had similar issues from her housekeeping jobs," Tiffany said. "Here, this helps." Before she could reconsider, she moved behind him and placed her hands on his shoulders, applying firm pressure to the knotted muscles. Brian tensed at her touch, and for a moment Tiffany thought she'd crossed an unforgivable line. Then, gradually, he relaxed under her hands, his head dropping forward slightly as she worked the tension from his shoulders. "Where did you learn this?" he asked, his voice roughened. "When you can't afford physical therapy, you learn alternatives." She focused on a particularly tight knot near his shoulder blade, trying to ignore the intimacy of the moment, the warmth of him beneath her fingers. When she finally stepped away, the atmosphere in the room had changed, charged with an awareness neither of them acknowledged. "We should continue with the projected valuation adjustments," Brian said, his voice deliberately even as he turned back to his laptop. They worked until well past midnight, the professional rhythm restored, but something new simmering beneath the surface. When they finally separated to their respective rooms, Tiffany found herself standing at her window, watching moonlight play across the restless ocean, wondering what undercurrents she had stirred in the controlled world of Brian Westwood. Morning brought clarity and renewed focus. Over coffee on the terrace, they finalized their strategy for the board presentation, the strange intimacy of the previous night submerged beneath their shared commitment to the work. "The board meeting has been moved up," Brian announced, checking his phone. "Tomorrow morning, not Monday. Lawrence must suspect we've found something in the Blackstone financials." "We'll be ready," Tiffany assured him. "The discrepancies are undeniable, and our alternative valuation model is solid." Brian studied her over the rim of his coffee cup. "You understand that Lawrence will question your involvement in this project. He'll claim you lack the experience and institutional knowledge to make these assessments." "Let him," Tiffany replied with quiet confidence. "The numbers speak for themselves." A rare smile, genuine and unguarded, transformed Brian's face. "Yes, they do. And so do you, apparently." The moment was interrupted by the arrival of Brian's assistant, Marcus, who'd driven out from the city with urgent documents requiring immediate attention. As Brian reviewed them in his study, Marcus lingered in the kitchen where Tiffany was organizing their presentation materials. "So you're the miracle worker who saved the Nakamura deal," he said, leaning against the counter with casual familiarity. "The office is buzzing about you." "I simply identified an overlooked opportunity," Tiffany replied, continuing her work. "Nothing is simple in Brian Westwood's world." Marcus studied her with undisguised curiosity. "He doesn't bring people to the Hamptons house. Ever." Tiffany kept her expression neutral. "This is a work session, nothing more." "If you say so." Marcus's smile was knowing. "Just be careful. The last woman who got close to Brian was Allison. When she crossed the line from professional to personal, she disappeared overnight." Before Tiffany could respond, Brian's voice cut through the room. "Marcus, you're needed in the study." As Marcus hurried away, Tiffany wondered about Allison, the executive assistant who had left suddenly, according to Victoria. What line had she crossed? And why did the thought disturb Tiffany more than it should? The afternoon brought a storm rolling in from the Atlantic, dark clouds gathering over the churning water. Inside the glass-walled study, Brian and Tiffany worked with renewed urgency, racing to complete their analysis before returning to the city. "The board will want concrete examples of Blackstone's valuation inflation," Brian said, pacing before the windows as rain began lashing against the glass. "We need to present alternatives that protect the acquisition while addressing the discrepancies." "What if we structure a performance-based valuation?" Tiffany suggested. "Tie the final purchase price to actual performance metrics of their Asian holdings over the next 24 months. Brian stopped pacing, turning to look at her with newfound respect. That would protect Monarch while giving Blackstone incentive to deliver actual value rather than inflated projections. Exactly. It transforms a potential liability into a mutual benefit. Brian crossed to where she sat at the conference table and leaned down to examine her calculations. His proximity sent an unexpected shiver through her, his scent a subtle blend of sandalwood, and something distinctly his own, his breathing steady as he studied her work. "This could work," he murmured, his voice close enough that she could feel his breath on her cheek. "It's elegant." When he straightened and stepped away, Tiffany released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Outside, lightning cracked across the darkened sky, momentarily illuminating the room in stark white light. "The storm's intensifying," Brian noted, checking his phone. "The coastal road will be flooded soon. We should leave now if we want to make it back to the city tonight." They packed their materials quickly, but by the time they reached the car, sheets of rain were falling in blinding torrents. They'd barely made it a mile when they encountered a roadblock, state troopers diverting traffic from the flooded coastal route. "The inland road adds 2 hours in good weather," Brian said. frustration evident in his voice as he reversed course. "In this storm, it's not worth the risk." Back at the house, they shed their rain-soaked outer layers in the foyer. Brian disappeared briefly, returning with towels and 2 crystal tumblers of amber liquid. 18-year-old Macallan, he said, handing her a glass. "A suitable remedy for frustration." Tiffany accepted the offering, allowing the warmth of the scotch to chase away the chill of the rain. Brian had changed into a simple black sweater and jeans, attire she'd never imagined him wearing, yet which somehow made him more real, more human than the impeccably suited CEO. "We'll have to finalize the presentation remotely," she said, trying to maintain professional focus despite the increasing intimacy of their situation. "The internet connection is unstable during storms," Brian replied, moving to light the fireplace in the adjacent living room. "We'll have to trust what we've prepared is sufficient." As flames illuminated the space, casting dancing shadows across the room, Tiffany was struck by the surreal nature of the moment. Stranded in a luxury beachfront home with one of New York's most powerful men, the boundary between professional and personal increasingly blurred. Brian settled into a leather chair across from her, the firelight softening the hard angles of his face. "You never answered my question yesterday about whether you would have chosen finance if given all options." The question surprised her. "I suppose I never considered other options as realistic possibilities. Finance offered a clear path out of poverty. And if money were no object, what would Tiffany Rhodes choose?" She considered this hypothetical freedom, a luxury she'd never been afforded. "I'd still work with numbers and patterns, but perhaps applied differently. Economic development in underserved communities, creating financial literacy programs for women in poverty." She smiled faintly. "Dreams for another lifetime. Why not this one? The luxury of pursuing passion projects requires capital and connections I don't have." Brian studied her over the rim of his glass. "You underestimate your capabilities. Your analysis of Blackstone's financials was more insightful than work from analysts with 20 years' experience. Your approach to Nakamura saved a deal worth billions." "Are you actually paying me a compliment, Mr. Westwood?" Tiffany asked, allowing a hint of teasing into her voice. The corner of his mouth lifted in that almost smile. "Stating facts isn't the same as offering compliments, Miss Rhodes." The formality of their address stood at odds with the intimacy of the setting. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky, rain pelting against the windows in rhythmic waves. "Tell me about the architectural engineering," Tiffany said suddenly. "The path not taken." Something flickered in Brian's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, that she had remembered this detail from their earlier conversation. "I was designing sustainable urban housing," he said after a moment. "Finding ways to create beautiful, environmentally responsible spaces accessible to average incomes, not just the wealthy." "That sounds nothing like Monarch Industries." "It wasn't meant to be." For the first time, Tiffany glimpsed genuine regret in his expression. "My father found my designs, called them idealistic nonsense. The next week he appointed me to Monarch's Junior Executive Committee. The message was clear. And after he died, Monarch became my responsibility. 8,000 employees, millions in pensions, a legacy spanning 2 generations. He stared into the fire. Personal dreams became irrelevant. "Beat." Tiffany recognized the weight of duty in his words, understood suddenly that the cold, demanding CEO persona was as much a constructed facade as the gleaming Monarch Tower itself. "The house is beautiful," she said softly. "Your design honors both function and human experience. It's art with purpose." Brian looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing something new. The silence between them lengthened, charged with unspoken recognition. The sharp ring of his phone shattered the moment. Brian checked the screen, his expression instantly hardening as he answered. "Lawrence," he acknowledged coldly. "What couldn't wait until morning?" As he listened, his jaw tightened, eyes narrowing dangerously. "That's absurd. Her qualifications are impeccable." Another pause. "The board has no authority to dictate staffing decisions on special projects." Tiffany realized with a start that they were discussing her. "This conversation is over, Lawrence." Brian ended the call abruptly, his expression thunderous as he turned to Tiffany. "Lawrence is demanding your removal from the Blackstone project. He claims your involvement represents a security risk given your temporary status and lack of institutional history with Monarch." "He's trying to undermine the presentation," Tiffany concluded. "If I'm removed, the analysis loses its advocate, and your position with the board is weakened." "Yes." Brian's expression was calculating. "He's forcing a choice, protect you or protect the deal." "There's no choice to make," Tiffany said firmly. "The Blackstone acquisition is worth billions to Monarch. I'm a temporary employee who's been there 3 days. Brian studied her, his expression unreadable. "Is that how you see yourself? Expendable?" "I see myself as practical, Mr. Westwood. We both know Lawrence is looking for any opportunity to challenge your leadership. Don't give him ammunition over someone who won't even be at Monarch next week." Something shifted in Brian's eyes, a hardening, a retreat behind the CEO facade. "Very practical indeed, Miss Rhodes." He stood abruptly. "It's late. We should both get some rest before tomorrow's battle." The sudden formality felt like a door slamming shut. As Brian left the room, Tiffany remained by the fire, wondering why his retreat left her feeling strangely bereft, and why the rational choice she'd offered felt increasingly like a loss she wasn't prepared to accept. In her guest suite, Tiffany stood at the window watching the storm rage against the cliffs, much like the conflicting emotions within her. In just 3 days, she had glimpsed the man behind Brian Westwood's carefully constructed walls, seen both his brilliance and his buried dreams, his ruthless pragmatism and his capacity for unexpected gentleness. What she couldn't yet admit, even to herself, was that for the first time in her rigorously disciplined life, Tiffany Rhodes was in danger of allowing emotion to cloud her judgment. And in the high-stakes world of Monarch Industries, such weakness could cost her everything she'd fought to achieve. What she didn't know was that in his own room, Brian Westwood stood at an identical window, watching the same storm, wrestling with a decision that had suddenly become far more complex than a simple choice between business and loyalty. For the first time since taking control of Monarch, Brian found himself considering a path that served neither the company's interests nor his own carefully guarded isolation, but something new and undefined, something that had begun the moment Tiffany Rhodes walked into his office and refused to be dismissed. Morning arrived with clearing skies and an unspoken tension that lingered between Tiffany and Brian during the silent drive back to Manhattan. The intimacy of the previous evening had been replaced by Brian's trademark reserve, his responses clipped and professional as they prepared for the board meeting. As they entered Monarch's executive floor, Victoria intercepted them with barely concealed anxiety. "The board is already assembled. Lawrence called an executive session before your scheduled presentation." "Of course he did," Brian muttered, straightening his tie. "Prepare the conference room. We'll need the projection system for the Blackstone analysis." Victoria hesitated, glancing nervously at Tiffany. Lawrence left specific instructions that only current Monarch executives are permitted in the meeting. Brian's expression hardened. "Miss Rhodes's analysis forms the core of our presentation." "I can provide the materials without attending," Tiffany suggested pragmatically. "Your familiarity with the findings is comprehensive." For a moment, something like conflict flashed in Brian's eyes. Then he nodded curtly. "Upload the final presentation to the secure server. I'll handle the board." As Brian disappeared into the boardroom, Victoria touched Tiffany's arm sympathetically. Lawrence has been on the warpath since yesterday. He's been making calls to every board member, raising concerns about your access to confidential information. What exactly is he implying? Tiffany asked, a sense of unease growing within her. That's the thing. Victoria lowered her voice. He's been asking questions about your background checks, security clearance procedures. It's as though he's looking for something specific. The board meeting stretched for over 2 hours. From her temporary workstation, Tiffany could see the frosted glass walls of the conference room, occasionally catching glimpses of animated discussion. At one point, Lawrence's voice rose loud enough to carry through the doors, something about irresponsible security risks and proper protocols. When the doors finally opened, board members filed out with expressions ranging from concern to satisfaction. Lawrence emerged looking thunderous, his gaze finding Tiffany across the floor with undisguised hostility before he stalked toward the elevators. Brian was the last to exit, his face an unreadable mask as he approached her desk. The board has approved the Blackstone acquisition with our revised valuation structure, he said, his voice neutral. Your performance-based model was particularly effective in addressing their concerns. That's excellent news, Tiffany replied, searching his expression for any hint of what else had transpired. And the security issues Lawrence raised? Something flickered in Brian's eyes. My office, please. Shish, inside his sanctuary of glass and steel, Brian moved to the window, his back to her, as he stared out at the city spread below them. For several moments, he remained silent, tension radiating from his rigid posture. Lawrence conducted his own investigation into your background, he finally said, his voice controlled. He presented his findings to the board this morning. Cold dread pooled in Tiffany's stomach. What findings? Your mother's name appears in an old fraud case involving a Chicago investment firm where she worked as a cleaner 20 years ago. Nothing was ever proven against her, but Lawrence insinuated a pattern of questionable ethics might be hereditary. The accusation struck Tiffany like a physical blow. Her mother had worked countless hours, sacrificed everything to give her daughter opportunities she never had. The suggestion that she was anything less than honest was unforgivable. My mother is the most ethical person I know, she said, her voice tight with controlled fury. She found discrepancies in the firm's accounting while cleaning their offices and reported them. She was fired for her honesty, not for any wrongdoing. Brian turned, his expression grave. I'm aware of that. The simple statement hung in the air between them for a moment, before its full implication registered. You're aware? Tiffany repeated slowly. You already knew about this. Brian met her gaze directly. I had my security team conduct a thorough background check after your first day. Standard procedure for anyone with access to sensitive information. Standard procedure, she echoed, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. Their conversations in the Hamptons, his questions about her background, her mother, her motivations, took on a new, calculating light. You were testing me, seeing if I would disclose it voluntarily. I was assessing your integrity, Brian corrected, his tone maddeningly reasonable, while withholding the fact that you were investigating me. Tiffany maintained her composure through sheer force of will. Did you also investigate my Harvard professors, my former employers, perhaps my high school boyfriends? Tiffany. Miss Rhodes, she corrected coldly, since we're maintaining professional standards now. Brian's jaw tightened. The background check was routine. The board required reassurance. The board or you, Tiffany interrupted, because it seems to me that trust flows in only one direction at Monarch Industries. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. I understand corporate precautions, Mr. Westwood. What I don't understand is why you continued questioning me about my background in private when you already had your answers. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken accusations. Outside the glass walls of Brian's office, the business of Monarch Industries continued unabated, people moving through their routines, unaware of the quiet devastation unfolding within. "I value your work," Brian finally said, his voice carefully controlled. "Your contribution to both Nakamura and Blackstone has been exceptional, but not enough to warrant basic professional respect." Tiffany gathered her dignity around her like armor. "I believe our arrangement was for 1 week. After the events of this morning, I think it's best if we conclude it now." For a moment, something like genuine regret flashed across Brian's features. "That would be premature. The Blackstone integration will require someone with institutional knowledge of Monarch," Tiffany finished for him. "Someone the board trusts, someone who passes Lawrence Winterfield's ethical purity test." She placed her security badge on his desk. "That clearly isn't me." Brian stared at the badge, his expression shuttered. "You're making an emotional decision." "No, Mr. Westwood. I'm making a decision based on values, something I learned from my mother." Tiffany held his gaze. "Thank you for the opportunity. I wish you success with the acquisition." She turned and walked toward the door, each step requiring immense control to maintain her composure. "Tiffany." Brian's voice stopped her at the threshold. When she looked back, his expression had lost its mask of corporate detachment, revealing something raw and unguarded. "This isn't what I want." For a brief moment, Tiffany allowed herself to remember the man by the fireplace, the architect with buried dreams, the human beneath the CEO. Then she remembered the calculated questions, the hidden investigation, the fundamental breach of trust. "What you want, Mr. Westwood, has always been clear. Monarch above all else." She straightened her shoulders. "I respect that dedication. I simply choose not to be collateral damage to it." The elevator doors closed on the image of Brian Westwood standing alone in his glass empire, and Tiffany finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of disappointment crushing her chest. Not for the lost opportunity at Monarch, but for something far more personal, the glimpse of connection that had never been real. As her cab crawled through midday Manhattan traffic toward Brooklyn, Tiffany's phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from Victoria, then from an unknown number she suspected was Brian. She ignored them all, focusing instead on recalibrating her plans. The temp agency would have other assignments, perhaps not at Monarch's level, but somewhere she could rebuild her professional momentum without the complications of silver-eyed CEOs with trust issues and haunted pasts. By evening, she had updated her resume, contacted 3 recruitment agencies, and methodically boxed away the emotions that threatened to cloud her judgment. Tiffany Rhodes had survived far worse setbacks than a premature end to a temporary position. She would survive this too. When her doorbell rang at 9:30, she assumed it was the Thai food delivery she'd ordered. Instead, she found Victoria Palmer standing in the hallway of her modest Brooklyn apartment building, looking distinctly out of place in her designer suit. "How did you find my address?" Tiffany asked, too surprised to maintain her professional distance. "HR records," Victoria replied unapologetically. "May I come in? This isn't a social call." Inside Tiffany's small but meticulously organized apartment, Victoria declined the offered tea and came straight to the point. "Someone is systematically sabotaging the Blackstone deal, using information that was only available to people directly involved in the valuation analysis." Tiffany stiffened. "If you're implying—" "I'm not implying anything," Victoria interrupted. "If I suspected you, I wouldn't be here. But someone has leaked details of the discrepancies you discovered to Blackstone's chief competitor, who is now positioning for a hostile takeover using exactly the leverage points you identified." "That's impossible. Those findings were only shared with Brian and the board." Victoria's expression was grim. Precisely, which means our saboteur sits at the highest level of Monarch. Brian is convening an emergency session tonight to contain the damage, but he's operating blind without knowing who's behind the leak. Understanding dawned. And he sent you to ask for my help? No. Victoria's response was immediate. He expressly forbade anyone from contacting you. He said, and I quote, "Miss Rhodes has made her position clear. Her integrity deserves our respect." The words hit Tiffany with unexpected impact. "Then why are you here?" Victoria's professional composure cracked slightly. "Because I've worked with Brian Westwood for 7 years, and I've never seen him look the way he did when you walked out. And because Monarch is facing a crisis that could destroy everything he's built." She hesitated. "Whatever happened between you two in the Hamptons?" "Nothing happened," Tiffany interjected firmly. "Right." Victoria's skepticism was evident. "That's why he's been staring at your empty desk all afternoon instead of addressing the corporate espionage threatening his company." Tiffany turned away, fighting the unwelcome surge of emotion. "This isn't my problem anymore." "Of course not." Victoria rose to leave. "Your integrity is intact, your principles upheld. Very admirable." At the door, she paused. "The emergency meeting is at 11. The security desk has instructions to admit you if you change your mind." After Victoria left, Tiffany paced her small apartment, warring with herself. The rational decision was clear. Maintain her distance from Monarch Industries and the complications it represented. She had made her stand on principle. Returning would undermine that entirely. Yet as the minutes ticked by, she found herself remembering not Brian's betrayal, but the glimpses of the man beneath. The abandoned dreams of creating spaces that would help others, the burden of responsibility he carried, the rare moments when his carefully constructed walls had lowered. At 10:45, Tiffany made her decision. Some principles transcended personal hurt. If Monarch was under attack from within, and if her analysis was being weaponized against the company, she had a responsibility to help correct it, regardless of her feelings toward Brian Westwood. The night security guard at Monarch recognized her immediately. "Miss Rhodes, Mr. Westwood left instructions." "I know, thank you." The executive floor was transformed after hours, subdued lighting casting long shadows, the usual bustle replaced by tense silence. Through the glass walls of the main conference room, Tiffany could see a gathering of Monarch's most senior executives. Brian stood at the head of the table, his back to the door, while Lawrence Winterfield spoke animatedly, hands gesturing in apparent argument. When she entered, conversation stopped abruptly. All eyes turned to her, but Tiffany registered only Brian's, widening slightly in genuine surprise before his composure returned. "Miss Rhodes," he acknowledged, his voice carefully neutral, "this is an unexpected development. I understand there's a situation involving my analysis of Blackstone." She maintained her professional tone, addressing the room rather than focusing solely on him. "If my work is being misused, I'd like to help correct that," Lawrence scoffed. "Your help has already created this catastrophe. Nexus Capital is using your exact findings to undermine our acquisition, findings that were strictly confidential." "Which means the leak came from someone in this room," Tiffany replied calmly. "My analysis never left Monarch's secure server." Brian's expression remained unreadable, but something in his posture had shifted, a subtle tension releasing at her words. "Miss Rhodes, would you be willing to review the Nexus documentation? Your familiarity with the original analysis might help identify exactly what was leaked and how it was altered." For the next 2 hours, Tiffany worked alongside Monarch's crisis team, meticulously comparing the Nexus Capital takeover documents with her original Blackstone analysis. The similarities were undeniable. Specific weaknesses she had identified in Blackstone's Asian holdings were being targeted with surgical precision. Yet subtle differences in the financial modeling suggested the information had been filtered through someone with a sophisticated understanding of both companies. As the team analyzed the documents, Tiffany became aware of Brian watching her, not with suspicion, but with a quieter, more contemplative expression. When she identified a critical mathematical pattern in the nexus approach, he moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could detect the faint scent of his cologne. "This methodology," she said, pointing to a complex calculation in the nexus proposal, "it's an inverse application of the performance-based valuation model I created for Monarch. Someone didn't just leak my findings, they provided my entire analytical framework, then reversed it to create the perfect counter-strategy." Brian studied the figures, his shoulder nearly touching hers. Only someone with a complete understanding of both the analysis and its application could have done this. Their eyes met in simultaneous realization. "Someone on the board," Tiffany murmured. "Someone with access to the complete presentation," Brian agreed, his voice equally low. Across the room, Lawrence was engaged in intense conversation with two other executives, his back to them. "Lawrence opposed the deal from the beginning," Tiffany whispered. "But this level of sabotage seems extreme even for office politics." "This isn't about office politics," Brian replied grimly. "This is about control of Monarch itself. If the Blackstone acquisition fails catastrophically, the board might question my leadership." Understanding dawned, and with your position weakened, Lawrence could make a play for control. "Exactly." Brian's gaze remained on Lawrence's back. "But suspicion isn't proof. We need evidence of the leak." As the night progressed, the crisis team developed containment strategies, while Tiffany worked with Marcus to trace the digital footprint of her analysis through Monarch's system. By 4 in the morning, most of the executives had departed, leaving only Brian, Tiffany, and a handful of IT specialists still working. In the relative privacy of a side conference room, Tiffany reviewed server access logs when Brian appeared with 2 cups of coffee, placing one silently beside her. "Thank you for coming back," he said quietly, leaning against the table. "You had every right to stay away." Tiffany accepted the coffee, the warmth of the cup a welcome relief for her tired hands. "I didn't come back for you, Mr. Westwood. I came because my work was being misused." "Brian," he corrected softly. "After everything, at least grant me that." She met his gaze directly. "After everything, I'm not sure what to grant you. Trust has to be earned." "I know." He held her gaze without flinching. "The background check was standard procedure, but continuing to question you personally was not. I should have been transparent." Coming from Brian Westwood, it was as close to an apology as she'd likely ever hear. Tiffany took a sip of coffee, considering his words. "Why did you keep asking about my background if you already had the information?" For a moment, he seemed to struggle with his response. "Because the reports told me facts, but not truth. They described your circumstances, but not how they shaped you. I wanted—" He paused. "I wanted to understand you beyond the data points." The admission hung between them, unexpectedly vulnerable. Before Tiffany could respond, Marcus burst into the room, tablet in hand. "We found something," he said breathlessly. "The leak didn't come from the main server. It came from a secure backup made the night before the board meeting, a backup authorized by Lawrence using his executive override." Brian straightened immediately, his expression hardening. "Where is Lawrence now?" "Gone. Security says he left 30 minutes ago. But there's more." Marcus handed over the tablet. "We found communications between Lawrence and Nexus Capital dating back 3 months. He's been orchestrating this from the beginning." The evidence was damning. Encrypted messages, meeting schedules, financial transactions carefully hidden through shell companies. Lawrence Winterfield, heir to one of Monarch's founding families, had systematically plotted to undermine the company he claimed to protect. He's scheduled to meet with Nexus executives at 7 this morning, Marcus continued, before the markets open. Brian checked his watch, just past 5 a.m. His expression was calm, but determined as he handed the tablet back to Marcus. "Prepare a complete evidence package for the board and our legal team. I want everyone assembled by 6:30. As Marcus hurried away, Brian turned to Tiffany. "I need to stop Lawrence before he finalizes this arrangement with Nexus." "You have the evidence now," she pointed out. "The board will see his betrayal clearly." "Evidence isn't enough. Lawrence has relationships with these people going back decades. I need to be there to confront him directly." He hesitated. "Would you join me?" The question surprised her. "Why?" "Because you understand this situation better than anyone. Because your analysis is at the heart of his scheme. Because—" He paused, something vulnerable flickering in his eyes before he continued. "Because I trust your judgment." The statement hung between them, weighted with significance beyond the immediate crisis. After his earlier breach of trust, these words represented something far more meaningful than a simple, professional endorsement. "All right," Tiffany agreed quietly. "Let's stop Lawrence." Dawn was breaking over Manhattan as Brian's car pulled up to the discreet entrance of the St. Regis Hotel. According to Marcus's intelligence, Lawrence was meeting Nexus executives in a private suite to finalize their strategy before the market opening. In the elevator rising to the 12th floor, Tiffany was acutely aware of Brian beside her, his composed exterior belying the intensity she sensed beneath. He had exchanged his rumpled shirt for a fresh one kept at the office, his appearance once again immaculate, despite the sleepless night. "Lawrence has been my father's closest friend's son," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. "He was meant to be my mentor when I took over Monarch." Tiffany heard the unspoken sense of betrayal in his voice. "Family businesses carry complex legacies." "Legacy," Brian repeated softly. "My father's favorite word. Everything for the legacy of Monarch." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "You would have hated him, and he would have hated me," Tiffany replied with unexpected lightness. "An outsider without connections or pedigree, challenging the established order." "Yes." Brian's gaze met hers, something unguarded in his expression. "But then, I'm not my father." The elevator doors opened, interrupting the moment. Following the directions Marcus had provided, they moved silently down the plush corridor to Suite 1242. Brian paused outside the door, listening. Multiple voices could be heard within, Lawrence's distinctive cadence rising above others in confident explanation. Brian looked at Tiffany once more, a silent question in his eyes. She nodded her readiness, and he knocked sharply on the door. The voices inside fell silent. After a moment, the door opened to reveal Lawrence Winterfield, his expression shifting from annoyance to shock as he registered their presence. "Brian," he managed, quickly regaining his composure. "This is unexpected. I'm in a private meeting." "With Nexus Capital," Brian stated calmly, pushing the door wider to reveal 3 men in suits seated around a table covered with documents. "Planning the hostile takeover of Blackstone using stolen Monarch analysis." Lawrence's face hardened. "This is a private business discussion that doesn't concern you. It concerns the company my father built, the company your father helped build." Brian's voice remained controlled, but Tiffany could sense the tightly leashed fury beneath. "It concerns the legacy you claim to protect while systematically betraying it." "Legacy?" Lawrence's laugh was bitter. "Your father always intended for our families to lead Monarch together." When he died, you seized complete control, ignoring generations of partnership. That's not true, Brian replied evenly. My father left controlling interest to me because he knew you valued power over responsibility. A convenient interpretation. Lawrence's gaze shifted to Tiffany, contempt evident. And now you bring your temporary assistant to witness this family dispute? How appropriate that an outsider should be present for the final dissolution of tradition. Brian stepped forward, his presence suddenly commanding the room. Miss Rhodes is here because her work is at the center of your betrayal, work you stole and corrupted for your own gain. One of the Nexus executives stood, clearly uncomfortable. Mr. Winterfield assured us the analysis was legally obtained through proper channels. Then he lied, Brian stated flatly. We have evidence of his unauthorized access to secured files, his communications with your firm dating back months, and the financial transactions between his shell companies and Nexus subsidiaries. Lawrence's face drained of color. You're bluffing. The board is reviewing the evidence as we speak. The SEC will receive copies within the hour. Brian held his gaze steadily. It's over, Lawrence. For a moment, Tiffany thought Lawrence might lunge at Brian, his hands clenched at his sides, face contorted with rage. Then suddenly the fight seemed to drain from him. He looked older, shoulders slumping as the weight of exposure settled over him. You have no idea what it's like, he said quietly. Watching you dismantle everything our fathers built together, replacing tradition with cold efficiency, treating Monarch like a machine instead of a legacy. Monarch was never about preserving the past, Brian replied, his tone softening slightly. It was about building the future. My father understood that. Yours did too. Lawrence shook his head. You've surrounded yourself with outsiders and algorithms, Brian. Where is the soul of what we built? Brian's gaze shifted briefly to Tiffany before returning to Lawrence. Perhaps the soul of Monarch needed fresh eyes to see it clearly. The Nexus executives gathered their materials hastily, distancing themselves from the unfolding drama. As they filed past toward the door, the most senior among them paused beside Brian. Westwood, he said quietly, for what it's worth, we would have preferred to work with you directly. Your reputation for integrity, despite your ruthlessness, is well earned. After they departed, leaving only Brian, Tiffany, and a defeated Lawrence in the suite, an uncomfortable silence descended. What happens now? Tiffany asked finally. Brian studied Lawrence with an unreadable expression. That depends on the board, and on Lawrence. Lawrence laughed hollowly. My resignation in exchange for avoiding criminal charges? How magnanimous. Your resignation, a comprehensive NDA, and your shares transferred to the Employee Pension Fund, Brian specified. In return, Monarch doesn't press charges or publicize your actions. It was a surprisingly merciful offer, one that protected Monarch's reputation while providing Lawrence a dignified exit. Tiffany glimpsed again the complexity of the man beside her, capable of cold business calculation and unexpected compassion in equal measure. I need time to consider, Lawrence said finally. Brian nodded once. The board meets at 9. I'll expect your decision before then. As they left the suite, the first rays of morning sun were streaming through the hotel windows, illuminating the corridor in golden light. In the elevator descending to the lobby, Tiffany felt the accumulated exhaustion of the sleepless night settling into her bones. What you offered Lawrence was generous, she observed quietly. It wasn't generosity, Brian replied, his gaze fixed on the descending floor numbers. It was pragmatism. A public scandal would damage Monarch more than his quiet departure. Still, many would have sought vengeance after such betrayal. Brian turned to look at her, something vulnerable flickering in his expression. Perhaps I'm learning that some traditions are worth preserving, while others deserve to be broken. The statement hung between them, laden with meaning that extended far beyond Lawrence Winterfield and Monarch Industries. As they exited the hotel into the brightening morning, Tiffany found herself at a crossroads, her professional principles still at odds with the undeniable connection she felt to this complex, contradictory man. What neither yet fully understood was that in the crucible of crisis, something fundamental had shifted between them, a truth emerging that would force them both to reconsider what they truly valued and what they were willing to risk to claim it. Morning sunlight flooded Monarch's executive floor as Tiffany sat in a quiet corner of the conference room, watching the board members file in. Despite the early hour, each arrived immaculately dressed, faces composed in careful neutrality as they took their seats around the massive table. The emergency session called to address Lawrence's betrayal had transformed into something more significant, a referendum on Monarch's future direction. Brian stood at the window, his back to the room, silhouette outlined against the Manhattan skyline. In the 3 hours since their confrontation with Lawrence at the St. Regis, he had spoken little, retreating behind the composed facade of CEO as preparations for the meeting consumed them. "Lawrence has accepted the terms," Victoria murmured, sliding into the seat beside Tiffany. "He'll resign effective immediately. No charges, no public scandal." The Blackstone deal?" Tiffany kept her voice equally low. "Back on track. Brian spoke personally with their CEO at dawn. The performance-based valuation model you created gave him the leverage to salvage the acquisition." A subtle satisfaction warmed Tiffany's chest. Her work, her actual contribution, had withstood the sabotage attempt. Whatever personal complications clouded her future at Monarch, her professional accomplishment remained intact. The board chair called the meeting to order, and Brian took his position at the head of the table. As he methodically outlined the events of the past 24 hours, Tiffany was struck by his precision and control. No hint of the emotional toll Lawrence's betrayal must have taken. "The attempted corporate espionage has been contained," he concluded, his voice steady. "The Blackstone acquisition will proceed with our revised valuation model, which protects Monarch's interests while ensuring fair market value." An older board member, a contemporary of Brian's father, spoke up. "And Lawrence? What arrangements have been made?" "Lawrence Winterfield has tendered his resignation, effective immediately. His shares will be transferred to the Employee Pension Fund as part of a negotiated settlement." Murmurs rippled around the table. Lawrence's departure marked the end of a dynasty, the severing of a relationship between founding families that had defined Monarch for generations. "This is a significant transition," observed another board member. "The Winterfields have been part of Monarch since its inception. Their institutional knowledge is valuable but not irreplaceable," Brian interjected smoothly. "Monarch's strength lies in our ability to evolve while honoring our core principles." Lawrence lost sight of those principles. His gaze briefly met Tiffany's across the table, something unspoken passing between them. "Which brings me to our final agenda item," Brian continued, squaring his shoulders slightly. "I am creating a new division within Monarch, special analytics and strategic valuation. This team will apply innovative methodologies to both our internal operations and acquisition targets." The announcement sparked immediate interest, board members leaning forward attentively. "And who will lead this division?" asked the board chair. "I'm appointing Tiffany Rhodes as director, reporting directly to me." Brian's voice remained professionally detached, but his eyes held Tiffany's with unmistakable intensity. Her exceptional work on both Nakamura and Blackstone demonstrates precisely the fresh perspective Monarch requires to maintain our competitive edge. Stunned silence fell over the room. Tiffany felt the weight of every gaze shift to her, evaluating, assessing. This wasn't just a job offer, it was Brian publicly aligning himself with an outsider, elevating her to a position of significant influence within his carefully guarded kingdom. "Miss Rhodes has only been with us for 4 days," pointed out one board member, voice carefully neutral. "This is an unconventional appointment." "Monarch wasn't built on convention," Brian replied. "It was built on recognizing exceptional talent and having the courage to nurture it. Miss Rhodes identified vulnerabilities our entire analytics team missed. She structured a deal framework that saved billions in the Nakamura negotiations, and she was instrumental in exposing the internal threat to our Blackstone acquisition." His defense was passionate yet measured, framed in business logic rather than personal preference. Tiffany recognized the strategy, appealing to the board's dedication to Monarch's success rather than challenging their traditional thinking directly. "I would like to hear from Miss Rhodes," said the board chair, turning to Tiffany. "This appointment comes with considerable responsibility. Are you prepared to accept?" All eyes turned to her expectantly. Brian's expression remained neutral, but Tiffany detected the subtle tension in his posture, the barely perceptible holding of breath as he awaited her response. In that moment, the choice crystallized for Tiffany. This was more than a career opportunity. It was Brian Westwood stepping beyond his controlled boundaries, taking a professional risk to create a place for her within his world. Yet the manner of the offer, presented as a fait accompli without prior discussion, echoed the same unilateral decision-making that had troubled her from the beginning. "I appreciate Mr. Westwood's confidence," she began carefully, "and I'm honored by the recognition of my work. However, I would need to consider an offer of this magnitude carefully before accepting." Surprise flickered across Brian's features, the first genuine emotion he'd displayed during the meeting. He had clearly expected immediate acceptance, not measured reservation. "Of course," the board chair nodded approvingly. "Thoughtful consideration befits such a position. Perhaps you might provide your decision by week's end." "That would be sufficient time, thank you." As the meeting adjourned, board members departed with murmured conversations, several pausing to introduce themselves to Tiffany with newfound respect. Through it all, Brian remained at the head of the table, his expression unreadable as he gathered his materials. When the room had emptied save for them, he finally spoke. "You're hesitating." It wasn't a question, but an observation, tinged with something that might have been confusion or disappointment. "I'm considering," Tiffany corrected gently. "There's a difference. The position would be tailored to your strengths. Full autonomy, reporting structure directly to me, compensation package commensurate with executive level." Tiffany studied him, noting the businessman's approach to what felt like a deeply personal crossroads. "Those are generous terms, but my hesitation isn't about compensation or title." "Then what?" A rare flash of frustration broke through his composure. "You didn't ask me, Brian. You simply announced it to the board as though my acceptance was assumed." She held his gaze steadily. "After everything we've experienced together these past days, do you still not understand that respect means allowing people to make their own choices?" Understanding dawned in his expression, followed by something that might have been regret. "I thought you would want this. A position where your talents would be recognized, valued." "I do want that," she acknowledged softly. "But I also want to be asked, not told. To be a partner in decisions that affect my life, not merely informed of them after they're made." Brian was silent for a long moment, seeming to absorb her words with genuine consideration. "I'm not accustomed to—" he began, then stopped, searching for words. "Partnership hasn't been part of my experience at Monarch, or anywhere." The admission held vulnerability that touched Tiffany unexpectedly. In that moment, she glimpsed again the man beneath the CEO, the architect whose dreams had been sacrificed to duty, the leader who had carried the weight of an empire alone for so long he'd forgotten how to share the burden. "I know," she said gently, "but perhaps that's what needs to change, for Monarch and for you." Before he could respond, Victoria appeared at the door. "Brian, the Nakamura representatives are waiting in conference room 3. They've flown in specifically to finalize the agreement in person." Brian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly at the interruption. "Tell them I'll be there shortly." After Victoria departed, he turned back to Tiffany. "We need to continue this conversation." "Yes," she agreed, "but your business needs you now." Something shifted in his expression, a subtle but significant change. For once, Monarch can wait. He reached for his phone, sending a brief message. "I've asked Victoria to reschedule Nakamura for this afternoon." The decision, small but symbolic, felt like a first step toward something new. A hairline crack in the fortress of obligation Brian had built around himself. "Thank you," Tiffany said simply. "Will you join me for lunch? Away from Monarch?" The invitation carried a vulnerability at odds with his usual commanding presence. "There's a place in the village. I'd like that." They rode the elevator down in companionable silence, the tension between them transformed into something more nuanced, an anticipation of possibilities yet to be explored. In the lobby, heads turned as they passed, the formidable CEO and the unknown woman walking beside him as equals. Outside, spring sunshine warmed the Manhattan streets, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of new beginnings. Brian directed his driver to a quiet street in Greenwich Village, far from Monarch's gleaming tower. The restaurant was a surprise, a small, unassuming Italian place tucked between brownstones, its modest exterior belying the warm elegance within. The maitre d' greeted Brian by name, leading them to a secluded corner table beneath a trellis of flowering vines. "You come here often?" Tiffany asked as they settled into their seats. "It was my mother's favorite." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "She would bring me here when my father was traveling. Said it reminded her of the year she spent in Florence before she married. The personal revelation, offered freely without prompting, felt significant." "What was she like? Beyond brilliant, I mean." Brian's expression softened as he poured wine into their glasses. "Independent, determined. She spoke 4 languages, designed award-winning bridges in her 20s, and could quote Shakespeare from memory." His voice quieted. "She wanted different things for me than my father did." "The architectural engineering," Tiffany guessed. "Yes, she encouraged it secretly, helped me apply to programs my father didn't know about." The memory seemed to both pain and comfort him. "When she became ill, I promised I would follow that path. After she died, my father discovered my acceptance to the master's program. He was displeased." And then he died before you could resolve it," Tiffany said softly, understanding the complex grief that must have entailed, the mingled regret, relief, and obligation. Brian nodded once, meeting her eyes with rare openness. "You see things clearly, Tiffany. It's what makes you exceptional at financial analysis, and—" He hesitated, then continued more quietly, "and at understanding people beneath their careful constructions." The conversation paused as their food arrived. Simple, exquisite Italian dishes prepared with obvious care. For several minutes they ate in comfortable silence, the weight of corporate politics and billion-dollar negotiations temporarily set aside. "Tell me about your mother," Brian said finally, "the woman who taught you such unwavering principles." Tiffany smiled, memories warming her. "She raised me alone after my father left when I was 3. Worked cleaning office buildings at night so she could be there when I came home from school. She had this rule: No matter how tired she was, she would sit with me for 1 hour each night while I did my homework. That's where you learned your work ethic. And my belief in possibilities. She would point to the executives whose offices she cleaned and tell me, someday you'll have a bigger office than theirs. She never saw limitations, only opportunities waiting to be claimed. Brian studied her with genuine interest. She must be proud of what you've accomplished. She is, Tiffany acknowledged, though she worries I work too hard. Tells me there's more to life than corner offices and financial statements. Wise woman, Brian murmured, his eyes holding hers with unexpected intensity. What else does she think is important? The question hung between them, laden with meaning beyond the simple words. Tiffany felt her pulse quicken as she held his gaze. Connection, she answered truthfully, finding people who see you, really see you, beneath the roles and expectations. And have you found that? His voice had softened, the question personal in a way Brian Westwood rarely allowed himself to be. I've glimpsed it, Tiffany replied carefully, in unexpected places. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibilities neither had yet found words to express. When Brian finally spoke again, his voice carried a vulnerability she'd never heard from him. The division I proposed, it wasn't just about your professional capabilities, though those are exceptional. It was about creating a place for you at Monarch, a reason for you to stay. The admission hung in the air, remarkable in its honesty. Is that what you want, Brian? For me to stay? Yes. The simple word carried weight beyond its single syllable. But I'm beginning to understand that how you stay matters as much as if you stay. It was perhaps the most significant concession he could make, an acknowledgement that her terms, her autonomy, her partnership were essential rather than optional. Ask me, she said softly, not as the CEO of Monarch Industries, as Brian. Something shifted in his expression, the last wall lowering, the final barrier between the man and the role he inhabited dissolving. Tiffany Rhodes, he began, his voice low and intimate, will you consider building something new at Monarch? With me, not for me. The distinction was everything, a recognition of equality, of shared vision, of mutual respect that transcended hierarchy. Yes, she answered simply, I will consider it. His smile, rare and genuine, transformed his face, revealing the man few were privileged to see beneath the CEO's mask. As they lingered over espresso, their conversation turned to possibilities, for the new division, for Monarch's evolution, for a relationship between them that defied easy categorization. When they finally emerged from the restaurant into the afternoon sunlight, something fundamental had changed, not just between them, but within each of them. The remainder of the day passed in a whirlwind of activity. The Nakamura meeting proceeded smoothly, with Brian publicly acknowledging Tiffany's contribution to the successful partnership. Lawrence's resignation was announced to the company in carefully worded terms that preserved both his dignity and Monarch's reputation. By evening, exhaustion from their sleepless night finally caught up with them. As the executive floor emptied, Tiffany found Brian in his office, standing before the windows, watching twilight settle over the city. You should go home, she said gently from the doorway. Get some rest. Tomorrow will bring new challenges. He turned to face her, his expression more open than she had ever seen it in this space. Will you be here to face them? I will, she confirmed, but not as a temporary assistant, as the director of strategic valuation who reports directly to you but makes her own decisions, who brings fresh perspective to Monarch but expects to be treated as a partner, not a subordinate. Brian crossed the room to stand before her, close enough that she could see the subtle variations of grey in his eyes, the faint shadow of stubble along his jaw. And outside of Monarch? He asked quietly. What would you be then? The question carried such naked vulnerability that Tiffany's breath caught. This powerful man, who controlled billions with a signature, was asking something no spreadsheet or market analysis could quantify: the value of emotional risk, the return on investing one's heart. "I would be Tiffany," she answered simply, "a woman who sees the architect behind the CEO, who understands the weight you carry but won't be crushed beneath it, who challenges you precisely because she believes in who you could be when you're not defined solely by Monarch Industries." Something raw and genuine flashed in Brian's eyes, hope mingled with uncertainty, desire tempered by the habits of isolation. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, the confession costing him visible effort. "Balance Monarch with something more personal." "Neither do I," Tiffany acknowledged with a soft smile. "But I'm willing to try if you are." For a long moment he studied her face, as though memorizing every detail. Then, with deliberate care, he reached out to brush his fingers along her cheek, the touch tentative yet electric. "I've never wanted to try before," he confessed. "Not since taking over Monarch. It seemed impossible, irresponsible. And now?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Now, it seems like the only thing that matters." The admission hung between them, transformative in its honesty. When Brian finally lowered his head to hers, the kiss was gentle, a question rather than a demand, an invitation rather than a claim. Tiffany responded with equal gentleness, her hands coming to rest lightly against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath expensive fabric. The connection deepened slowly, neither rushing toward what both sensed was a beginning rather than a culmination. When they finally drew apart, Brian's expression held wonder, mingled with determination. "I don't want this to be something hidden, Tiffany, not an office secret or a corporate rumor." "Neither do I," she agreed, "but Monarch will talk. The board will question your judgment. The executives will assume I'm advancing through connection rather than capability." "Let them talk," Brian said with newfound conviction. "For the first time since taking control of Monarch, I'm choosing something that matters to Brian Westwood, not just to the company's bottom line." His phone chimed. Another crisis, another demand from the empire that had consumed his life for so long. This time, Brian ignored it, his attention remaining fixed on Tiffany. "Have dinner with me tomorrow," he said. "Not as CEO and director, just as Brian and Tiffany." The simplicity of the invitation, its normalcy, touched her deeply. "I'd like that." As they left Monarch together that evening, riding the elevator down to the lobby side by side, Tiffany reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past week. She had arrived as a mistaken hire, fighting for recognition in a world designed to exclude her. Now, she departed as both a respected professional and a woman who had somehow breached the carefully constructed walls around Brian Westwood's guarded heart. Outside, Manhattan's lights sparkled against the darkening sky, a tapestry of possibilities stretching before them. Brian's hand found hers as they walked toward his waiting car, the contact natural and unforced. "What are you thinking?" he asked, noting her contemplative expression. Tiffany smiled, squeezing his hand gently. "That sometimes the most valuable opportunities come from the most unexpected mistakes." Brian's answering smile, warm and genuine, transformed his face completely. "Then perhaps it wasn't a mistake at all, but exactly where we were both meant to be." As his car pulled away from the curb, carrying them toward a future neither could have imagined days earlier, Tiffany recognized the truth in his words. In the high-stakes world of Monarch Industries, among billion-dollar deals and corporate rivalries, the greatest risk and the most valuable reward had nothing to do with financial statements or market valuations. It was the risk of genuine connection. The chance to be seen, truly seen, by someone who recognized both your strength and vulnerability. The opportunity to build something together that transcended balance sheets and boardrooms. And for both Tiffany Rhodes and Brian Westwood, two people who had spent their lives calculating risks and returns, this new investment of the heart promised the most precious dividend of all, the freedom to be fully themselves, together.